On this episode, a husband and stepfather is brutally murdered after a family outing, a tri-state manhunt for the killer, and an alert detective notices a discrepancy in the surviving family member's story. From October of 1956 on this episode of True Crimes of the Atomic Age. The 1950s is a time rightfully lauded as an era of family values. It was also a time of social change, both within American society and in pop culture, both of which resonate today. However, human nature is a constant for any time period, and the 1950s, being occupied by human beings, was concerned with the same social ills that have plagued humanity since the beginning of our existence. These were issues of poverty, social unrest, political instability and agendas, and crime. To deny that violent crime was a concern of 1950s society, to downplay or even state that such incidents did not exist or were supposedly unimportant, is to deny ourselves our ability to learn about our shared humanity and to hopefully reduce or even prevent such acts from occurring again. For both the highest aspirations of human kindness and the worst examples of the dark side of human nature have always existed side by side throughout humankind's existence. It is true today, and it was also true during the good old days of the post-World War II era of the late 1940s through the early 1960s, and during the actual decade between those two, that was the golden age of America. To leave out the bad parts of history is to actually dismiss the concerns that society of the past held, or to learn from the lessons that they left us. It is with this spirit that we present this series, True Crimes of the Atomic Age, the 1950s. The 1950s and early 1960s housewife and mother, devoted, caring, always there to selflessly support her children and her husband, all while keeping house and looking perfect.
Don't be silly. The man at the store says he sells a lot of them.
There must be a lot of mothers teaching their sons how to fight.
Get into position.
The trope is a staple of many a 1950s and early 1960s TV sitcom. Barbara Billingsley's June Cleaver, Jane Wyatt as Margaret Anderson in Father Knows Best, Donna Reed as Donna Stone in her self-titled sitcom, and Harriet Nelson playing a fictional version of herself on The Adventures of Ozzie and Harriet. The trope is so iconic that often these fictional characters are used as examples of what real-life 1950s motherhood was all about. An unbiased look at motherhood would show that most typical mothers of any time period, generally at least, try to have their families, particularly their children's, best interests at heart. A mother's love and devotion is what has enabled the human species, and for that matter, most mammalian and bird species, to survive as long as they have. Some would argue that it's hardwired and biological, the mother bear aggressively attacking anything that comes within close proximity of her cubs, being an example from nature. And if we're to keep our focus on the 1950s decade and human beings, arguably the most famous example of a devoted real-life mother and child bond would be that of Gladys Presley to her beloved son, rock and roll icon Elvis Presley. Still, as with anything, there are always exceptions. If the fictional June Cleaver is the ideal post-war atomic age mother, then Angela Lansbury's manipulative and even incestuous Eleanor Shaw from 1962's The Manchurian Candidate would be her exact opposite in the popular fiction of the time. Then, of course, There's the unhealthy relationship between Anthony Perkins' Norman Bates character and his mother, murdered off-screen and replaced in drag by the lead character in Hitchcock's iconic 1960 adaptation of Robert Bloch's 1959 novel Psycho, itself based on the life and infamous murders committed by Ed Gein, who in real life had a dysfunctional relationship with his own mother.
Well, a boy's best friend is his mother.
The deviancy of these fictional characters were always presented as the exception on screen, and they all shared one thing in common. They were presented as selfish, manipulative, and they put their own emotional interests so far ahead of their own children that it even endangered them. As for the real post-war atomic age, news items and court documents, then as now, gave examples of these exceptions. Women who were so monstrous in their selfishness that their own children were often put in danger. For these individuals, their children were not the focus of love and affection, but were either obstacles, or, in the case of then 35-year-old Gladys Martin, days before Halloween in 1956, a tool to be used. 3 days before Halloween, on October 28, 1956, this real-life horror story unfolded as 32-year-old steelworker Robert Martin, his 15-year-old stepson Anthony Brubaker, Anthony's 12-year-old sister Marianne, and Gladys Martin, 35 years old, were driving back to their Hammond, Indiana trailer home after a visit with relatives in nearby Gary, Indiana. Robert Martin was in the back as his wife Gladys drove before, reportedly, stopping at the intersection of Ridge Road on Indianapolis Boulevard. According to both Gladys and her son Anthony, they had spotted a hitchhiker, a tall, slender man in his 30s, wearing khaki pants and a zipper jacket. Feeling sorry for the man, they allowed him into their car, where this man sat next to Robert, who was resting in the back. Robert had had a bit too much to drink at the family function, which is why Gladys was driving. A bit too much to drink. According to both Gladys and Anthony, the hitchhiker himself also reeked of alcohol, having the smell of whiskey on him, as well as being a bit soft-spoken with what they identified as a southern accent. Anthony and 12-year-old Marianne, again according to Gladys, were seated with her in the front. Marianne was sleeping. Both children were not Robert's, but were Gladys's by her second previous marriage.
Anthony was Robert Martin's stepson from Gladys's previous marriage. She had been married 3 times, and Robert was her third husband. By most accounts, Anthony seems to have been a good student, but he had a record with local Hammond police for being out past the local curfew, but nothing serious beyond that. Anthony Brubaker definitely wasn't a gang member type.